Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Fox with the Fox Alliance. Welcome to our fourth quarter economic outlook. Our goal is to offer insight into big economic themes. And our topic for today is breaking down the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll be discussing how the act affects energy and climate change, the Affordable Care Act, prescription drugs, and corporate and international tax. Our panelists will be speaking for 30 minutes and we'll leave 15 minutes for questions at the end. Based on our compliance rules, we can't take questions from our chat feature. So if you do have questions at the end, you'd like to ask our panel, please email them to me at the email address on the screen. Our presenters today will be Max Clark and Laura Cooper. Both are wealth advisors with the Fox Alliance. Our third presenter will be Josh Renfro. He's one of our managing partners. Max will be our first speaker. Max, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. So as Bill mentioned, we're going to be discussing really kind of the highlights of the Inflation Reduction Act, or abbreviated the IRA. As many of you guys may know, it was a pretty highly contested or highly partisan bill. In order to get it passed in the Senate, it required the Vice President, Kamala Harris, to cast the tie-breaking vote. But it ultimately made it through and was signed into law on August 16th, 2022. Before we jump into the details of what's in the bill, I think it'd be helpful for us to provide a brief overview of kind of the costs and savings associated with this bill and understand what the economics look like of the bill itself as it relates to the government's balance sheet. So the top box there, you can see the various policies that are resulting in costs to the government. Two big categories. One is energy and climate, which we'll be touching on here next. And you can see that that accounts for almost $400 billion of the costs associated with this bill. And then healthcare, which Laura will be covering, about $100 billion, totaling close to $500 billion in costs associated with the bill. Now, the government is looking to offset those costs and actually more than make up for them through the savings or the additional revenue that they're looking to generate from the bill. And the two key areas where you see that, there's going to be some health savings, about $322 billion, and then a few other key areas where revenue is looking to be increased. Two primary areas there are an increase in the corporate minimum tax, which Josh will be covering near the end of the presentation, and also the IRS Tax Enforcement funding, where they're looking to generate some additional revenue through increasing the tax enforcement on that side. Now, I'll get into the details of that. But you can see that the savings that or additional revenue that they're looking to generate is about $790 billion. And according to the government and the way that they calculate things, they're assuming that this should ultimately result in a net deficit reduction of a little over $300 billion. Josh will comment on that a little bit later. But this is a summary of the economics and how everything's set to look. One other thing that I'll point out, which I think is somewhat interesting, is despite the name of the bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CBO recently came out, the Congressional Budget Office, after doing some analysis on the bill, and they gave us a range of what they thought the impact on inflation this bill might have. And the range was minus 0.1% to plus 0.1%. So in their opinion, it'll virtually have no impact on inflation. And our perspective is, and you'll likely agree with us as we go through the details of the bill, it's likely to have more of an inflationary impact than a deflationary impact, which is surprising given the objective, or at least what the name suggests there, the objective of decreasing inflation. So that's the introduction. Let's move on to the details of the energy security and climate change portion of the bill. Again, this is the most expensive portion of the bill, close to $400 billion in cost. And effectively, the reason it's a cost is because they're giving tax credits to individuals on their tax return for various electric vehicle or energy climate change focused initiatives. The first is taking a credit that's already in place, the plug-in electric vehicle tax credit, and changing that to something they're referring to now as the clean vehicle credit. It's effectively the same thing, but they're increasing the credit a little bit. The maximum credit per vehicle is about $7,500. And the purpose here is that if you go out and purchase a new electric vehicle, you'd be able to receive a credit on your taxes of about a maximum of $7,500. Now, there are certain high income taxpayers that aren't eligible for this. You have to be making less than $300,000 a year as a couple and less than $150,000 a year as an individual. You can only use this on one vehicle per year, and there are some other limitations associated with it as well, but that is the first tenet here of the energy security and climate change portion. The second is creating a similar tax credit, but for used or previously owned electric vehicles. So in that case, the maximum credit is about $4,000, but it can also be limited by, you can only get credit for up to 30% of the vehicle purchase price. Again, there are other stipulations, other limits, as we would expect from the bureaucracy of our federal government. But the key thing here is certain high income taxpayers, again, are not eligible. In this case, however, though, you have to be making less than $150,000 per year as a couple, or less than $75,000 per year as an individual. Those two credits, the clean vehicle credit and the previously owned clean vehicle credit, both of those are set to expire in about 10 years, at the end of 2032. So those are the first two. The final credit that we're seeing in this portion of the bill is the residential energy efficient tax credit. This is, again, a credit that was already in place to incentivize people to create a more energy efficient home, either through the use of solar panels or something along those lines. And it was set to expire at the end of 2023. They have renamed it the Residential Clean Energy Credit, and it has now been extended through 2034. They've set that up to 30% credit on what you purchase. So you'll get a 30% credit on the purchase price of what you're installing in your home. And that will continue for effectively the next 11 or 12 years. Now, all of this is being put in place. And as I mentioned, it's pretty expensive. About $400 billion, a little under, is the cost to the federal government. And their objective, of course, is to, between now and the end of the decade, at the end of 2030, their hope is that they will see carbon emissions decreased by about 40%. That's really their objective. A couple of things that I'll note about this. It's interesting. I think this is probably one of the more inflationary pieces of the bill, because if you think about inflation, inflation is caused by an increase in economic activity. And effectively, what the federal government's doing here is incentivizing people to go out and purchase products, in this case, electric vehicle or clean energy products. And in the midst of a very inflationary cycle, it seems likely that this is going to be an inflationary aspect of the bill because they're promoting the purchase of additional products. The other thing I'll note on this front, though, is generally the time to put in place incentives from a government standpoint is early on in new technology or new strategy adoptions. And I think one could argue that we're well on the way to energy efficient or clean vehicle adoptions. That's evidenced by the fact that if you were to go out and try to purchase a new electric vehicle right now, there is a significant waiting list, a very long waiting list. It's going to take you in many cases 1 to 2 years to actually get your vehicle. So the fact that they're putting these incentives in place right now, it's really just likely to add to the significant backlog that we're already seeing. I don't know that it's going to have the effect of speeding up the adoption of these new electric vehicles or clean energy on their side that they're anticipating. But time will certainly tell. So that's the energy security and climate change portion. Let's move over to the next large tenet of this bill, which is the IRS tax enforcement. Over the next 10 years, it's anticipated that there will be about $80 billion added to the IRS budget, and they're going to spread that out over the 10-year period. The IRS has been talking for many years about the fact they don't have a sufficient budget to effectively enforce the tax code. So the lion's share of what they're receiving is likely going to go towards strengthening tax law enforcement. And that's likely going to increase the number of IRS agents and likely going to increase the number of tax audits that we're going to see across the board. The government's expecting this to produce over $200 billion in additional revenue over the course of that 10-year period. And that's going to net out after the cost of the $80 billion increase in the budget to about $120 billion net revenue to the federal government. Now, many suggest that, hey, this is probably only going to impact high income earners, people who are making over $400,000 per year. And our expectation is that that's probably not accurate. Maybe the majority of these additional tax audits will occur at the higher income levels. But our expectation is that it's going to impact people of all income ranges. And one of the primary reasons we believe that is if you look back to when this bill was being negotiated between the left and the right proposed a stipulation in the law to limit the tax audits above $400,000, limit the tax audits to individuals who are making above $400,000, and it was flatly refused by the left. So that suggests to us that it's likely that this is going to impact people of all income levels from a tax audit standpoint. So we'll see how all that plays out, but I think the likely outcome is that most people are going to see more oversight on the completion of their taxes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Laura, who's going to go over the medical side of this bill. Laura?
Thanks, Max. I'm going to talk about some changes to healthcare policy, specifically the Affordable Care Act, and some changes coming down the pipe for prescription drugs as it pertains to Medicare patients. So let's start with the Affordable Care Act. If you guys remember back in 2021, the American Rescue Plan was passed, a $1.6 trillion plan. And part of that plan was to provide premium subsidies for Affordable Care Act marketplace policies. And actually, the result of that was that it actually raised participation in the Affordable Care Act marketplace to the highest participation rate that we've ever seen since the passing of the ACA. Those premium subsidies, however, were expected to expire at the end of 2022. And with changes in the IRA, those will be extended for 3 additional years at about a cost of $25 billion per year. So what happens after 3 years, we'll see. It's going to depend on if this gets extended or not, but this is definitely one of the more higher cost portions of this bill. And so if we look at how the government is expected to pay for both the climate portion and the increase in ACA premium subsidies, they're making huge changes in the realm of prescription drugs as it pertains to Medicare patients. So the first thing that we expect to see is a direct negotiation with drug manufacturers on prices for about 10 drugs starting in 2026. And these are drugs that do not have a generic or biosimilar product available. So drugs that have not had their patents expired. And by 2029, that's expected to be 20 different drugs, biologics, and therapies that we expect to see negotiated as well. And they're expected to continue negotiating past 2029. So what that final number ends up being is to be seen. One thing that's really important to remember here, the government's expected to save about $101 billion over the next 10 years by making these negotiations. And that's not free money. That has to come from somewhere. And it's expected to us that it'll come out of the pockets of these drug companies, these drug manufacturers, come out of their revenue streams. And thinking about this long term, one of the biggest concerns that I have is the impact it's going to have on innovation in research and development. I think that the effect will be a lot more than $101 billion as far as revenue, because if you're a drug company that may be considering releasing a product to the market, but you know that your prices are going to be capped, or you know that your prices are going to be negotiated, and it might significantly hinder your profit margins, why would you release it to the market? So we'll see how this affects innovation and R&D over the next 10 years, but hopefully it doesn't have a huge negative impact there. The second thing that they're targeting are Medicare rebates. So for manufacturers who raise prices above inflation, they will be required to pay a rebate back to patients who have purchased those drugs. So if inflation's 5% and the drug cost goes up by 6%, drug manufacturers are required to pay that 1% difference to patients who purchase the drug. If they do not abide by this, if they decide to raise cost even higher than inflation anyway, then they do get taxed at 150% of the cost. So there is a penalty to these drug companies for choosing not to abide by these rules. The last part here is a redesign to Medicare Part D. And currently, under the current rules, cost liability for Medicare Part D lies 80% on Medicare, 15% to plans, to health plans, and 5% to beneficiaries. That'll be changing to 20% to Medicare, 60% to plans, and now 20% to drug manufacturers. So not only is Medicare's responsibility or their cost liability significantly decreasing as it pertains to Part D, but they're also including a 20% responsibility to drug manufacturers as well. So this is probably one of the biggest deflationary areas of change, expected to save them hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 years. And we'll see how that has an effect on biopharmaceutical markets moving forward. The last thing I'll mention is going back to the direct negotiation of these drug prices. The way that the government is planning on negotiating with these companies is by putting a really high tax, excise tax upon them if they choose to go above the negotiated price. Tax is up to 95%. 95%. So if these companies want to raise prices above negotiated cost, it's going to cost them a lot of money. And when you look at that from a tax exclusive rate, that could be an increase of over almost 2,000%, 1,900%. So this is pretty serious. This is not a loose number. These negotiated prices will be, for all intents and purposes, set in stone. So again, it would be really interesting to see how that affects the pharmaceutical markets over the next decade or so. With that, I will turn it over to Josh to finish us out.
Thanks, Laura. A couple of just quick things to point out before I move on to the tax side, and that is first off, when it comes to the cost of the bill, the claim is that it obviously is going to be an actual reduction to the deficit. And while that's true on paper, it is really important for us to understand how you slice and dice things can make it look very differently than it appears. So this is a classic case where we increase taxes and fees for 10 years, and then certain benefits we only make available for 2 or 3 years with the hope that basically we'll be able to put enough political pressure to extend them basically indefinitely. So a classic example of that is the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Right now, the Affordable Care Act subsidies are only extended for 3 years. If we were to actually look at what the cost of this bill would be with just the Affordable Care Act subsidies being extended throughout the life of the program, it takes away all of the potential savings and actually puts us about $150 billion in the hole. So it is important just to recognize that when you only provide the benefits for a certain period of time and leave it up to Congress to extend them, but have permanent tax increases or other penalties associated for 10 years, if you dice it certain ways, it can appear to be better than it is. But this is not going to be something that will pay for itself long-term, especially if everything gets extended. The second thing I did want to also just point out is one of the problems also with the prescription drug side of things is that now a lot of these drugs are incredibly expensive to develop, can be billions of dollars to do so, and many times they will fail. And so when a drug does finally succeed, usually a drug company is going to make a pretty significant profit for about 20 years to recover that cost. And then after that, then you can have general market participants create a more generic brand, which is a lot more cheap. So the challenge with the bill, one of the fears is that you will see specifically drugs that have a more limited audience not be developed to the same extent that it used to be, simply because the profits that drug companies will be able to make will probably be slowed substantially by this. And so that's one other concern, is how many people will literally not get a chance to even have a life-saving drug because it's expensive, and the government ultimately would regulate the cost down to a point that the drug company doesn't want to make it. So that is a concern that we have. Moving on to the corporate and international taxes side of things. So the first component here is a 15% minimum tax on corporations that have over $1 billion of income. So this is book income versus taxable income. So the question is, taxation policy is always meant to incentivize or de-incentivize specific behavior. And the question is, what ultimately is affected by this policy? So there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of bills that Congress have passed over the last 50 to 100 years that were designed to incentivize businesses to do different things. And they were given tax advantages for complying with different things that the government wanted them to do. The challenge with this bill, and specifically this portion of the bill, is that it effectively takes away a lot of the incentives that past Congresses and legislatures have been trying to push. Because now a lot of the tax advantages are gone. It's like, great, hey, if you want to do what past Congresses wanted to do in different areas, whether it's inclusion of particular areas or building manufacturing facilities in low income areas to try to generate jobs, you now don't get as many of those tax advantages, because even though you got the tax advantages, we're still going to guarantee tax you a 15% minimum. And so effectively, what this portion of the bill does, it does generate a lot of revenue, which helps to reduce the debt that we would incur otherwise from this bill. But the other thing that it does do is it takes away a lot of the power of past legislative sessions and incentives that they're specifically trying to have businesses operate with. So at this point, it's impossible to know exactly how significant of an effect that will ultimately have. And then the last portion of the tax policy here is a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks. So companies oftentimes, if they believe it makes more sense to purchase their own stock as opposed to invest in new opportunities, have had the freedom to do so without any cost. And now the government is saying, no, actually, you are going to have a cost to do that. So at the end of the day, that, it's not a huge tax. So does it probably significantly limit stock buybacks? No, but it will reduce stock buybacks at least by 1% over what they would have been otherwise. And who does that ultimately affect? It affects people who own stocks, people like yourself and your friends, retirees. This is not something that just helps corporations. It's individual retirees that it also helps as well. So those are the last components of the tax side. So with that, I'd like to move on and talk about some things that we believe are really interesting in the environment today. There's a lot of really interesting data that we could have shared today, and it was actually rather difficult deciding what we would ultimately choose to share. But I'm going to talk through about 10 different slides that are related to things that we think are important for people to know. So the first of which here is a slide that looks at housing, specifically at housing inventory. And so one of the things you'll notice is that while the number of homes under construction have increased here, you'll notice, and home inventories have started to climb a little bit. One of the things you'll notice is that if you look at the different years that are marked out, we are still substantially and very low housing inventory levels. We're still several, probably 25, 30% below 2015 levels and way below 2008 levels. So why is this important? This is important because if people are really afraid about housing prices dropping substantially, one of the things that would help that is having an increasingly large amount of inventory on the market. So far, while it has ticked up, it's not ticked up to other levels that would be a lot more concerning at this point. So that's the first slide we wanted to point out. The second one, also related to housing, is looking at mortgage origination by credit score. So if we go back here to 2008 and we look in the past, the light blue is the highest credit quality. We're looking at a credit score of 760 or higher. And you'll notice in the years 2008 and previous, the light blue only accounted for maybe 15 to 25% at most of those seeking to get a mortgage. And over 75% was everybody else. Specifically, the more problem credit scores, less than 660, accounted for somewhere between 15 and 25% of the market. You fast forward today, it's a very different story. In fact, even just over the last 2 or 3 years from 2020 on, the credit quality of people looking to borrow money is much, much higher, somewhere between 55 and 75%. Of the mortgage originations have occurred from people who are in the top credit scores, 760 or higher. More importantly, if you look at the yellow and blue, you'll notice that that number has dropped to probably less than 5% as a total overall. So that means that the health of the people that are getting the debt from a financial standpoint is much higher than it was back in 2008. Another really interesting chart that we came across is the supply chain pressure index, which is just a fancy way of saying how bad is the supply chain issues right now. And what you'll notice is coming out of 2020, we had a big spike. We saw it come back down. And then right around the time that we ended up injecting a lot more stimulus into the economy, the issues got bad again. But over the last 6 months, it is substantially declined from over 4.25 down to right around 1. Which means that the supply chain issues have gotten about 75% better than they were at the peak about 6 or 7 months ago. That still means that supply chain issues are affecting inflation. They're still a contributing factor, but they're not as big of a contributing factor as they were 6 to 18 months ago, which that's an encouraging thing on that side. Also kind of connected in with that, we've seen that manufacturing supply delivery times have come down dramatically, specifically data from the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. They found that we've seen that climb from 30 to actually -5, which means ultimately we're not seeing substantial supplier delivery time problems in the particular markets that they track, which is also encouraging. Another really interesting point, once again going to inflation, is looking at the cost of global freight containers. As you can see from this chart, from 2020 on, we saw global freight get incredibly expensive, from about $1,000 a container to over $10,000 a container. And then it kind of stagnated and stayed around that $8,000 to $10,000 area for quite a while. But over, once again, the last 6 months, we have seen a lot of those costs start to materially decline to the point that a cost of a global freight container now is right around $3 a unit. As opposed to the high of 10,000, still higher than it was. We're not at $1,000, but the number is still moving down. And so this is something that is deflationary. This is something that could actually help the inflation issues to get under control, because anything that we need that has to be shipped around the world was having to pay this cost. And that was ultimately getting passed on to you and me. So when we see this kind of number comes down, that can be a very encouraging piece as well. One other thing, with the stock market being as negative as it is right now, a lot of people would expect earnings or profits to be down. And actually at this point, we're starting to get third quarter profit numbers, but we are getting those, and we're also having expectations of what fourth quarter numbers will look like. And right now, this year is not expected to be a gangbuster year by any means, but we are still expecting about a 6.1% profit growth over last year. Not typically something that you see in a very, very severe recession. I mean, even look back here at 2020, Q1 earnings were down 14%, Q2 down 31.6%, Q3 down 6.7%. So approximately 50% decrease in earnings. Now, obviously 2020 was a really particular situation with the economy getting shut down, but even 2008 also saw very severe drops in profits. So far, we have not seen this be like a traditional recession. We haven't seen a large drop in corporate profits. That's not to say that they won't drop, but so far, the weakness that we're seeing is slower growth, not actual drops in profits so far. Moving on. One other interesting thing, you guys may remember from our previous episode, we discussed extensively some of our worries surrounding China, specifically its real estate market. If you remember, 70% of the Chinese population's wealth is vested in their real estate. And we're starting to see a collapse of the Chinese real estate market, partially because of developers and them overextending themselves, and the Chinese Communist Party increasing or cutting off their access to capital. But then also we've got certain Chinese factions that are not working to pay their mortgages right now. So you're seeing a lot of pressure. And you're also seeing at this point, certain property developers just completely default on their debt. And so one of our questions that we wanted to do research on was find out how exposed are non-Asian or non-Chinese investors to the debt in China, specifically the real estate debt. And what we found was actually pretty encouraging. In 2012, 37% of all Chinese credit were owned by US or European investors. Today, that number has declined to only 8%. So that's encouraging because from a primary effects standpoint, we shouldn't expect a lot of financial stress due to direct exposure to Chinese debt or Chinese real estate in the West. That does not preclude being affected by the secondary and tertiary effects of the weakness that China will experience from its real estate problems feeding into the global economic system. But at least primary exposure seems to be very limited, which is also a good thing. One last thing to wrap up here on is one more thing related to China. So if you guys remember from maybe 3 or 4 episodes ago, we talked about how the global economy is beginning to change in a significant way, and China specifically, due to the Communist Party's changing of agenda. And one of the major core tenets of that change in agenda related to energy independence. China is not a country that is rich with natural resources. They have to either ship in their oil and natural gas or do so via a pipeline, both of which make them susceptible to foreign powers intervening to stop that flow of natural resources. And that's something that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want. And so one of their biggest responses to this has been the building of new nuclear facilities. And so China actually is planning to build an additional 150 more nuclear power plants over the next 15 years on top of the 228 that are already in development, meaning they will have over, in a span of about 5 to 10 years, an additional 400 power plants that will be built beyond what they already have on the nuclear side. And just to kind of give you a sense of how significant this is, just shows what they have currently under development compared to every other country in the world. And that right now, China has more nuclear power plants under development than every other country in the world combined at this point. That will make them significantly less energy dependent on the West, on the Middle East, on any country for that matter. And nuclear is both cost effective. It's actually much cheaper than hydrocarbons or any other form of renewable energy once the initial investment is made. It's expensive on the front end. That 150 new power plants that they're going to build are going to cost them about $440 billion to do so. But once it's done, nuclear power is some of the cheapest power and also clean power out there. And unlike other renewables that have problems with weather, nuclear power is consistent throughout. So we're continuing to see China actually act on their new priorities in a big way that will likely impact the global stage in a significant way. I want to wrap up with one just final thought. So we've talked about some things that are positive things, a lot of things that are negative. We feel that until we see inflation begin to drop, that we've not seen the worst of what economically is yet to come. But despite that, we're still very optimistic over the long term. Why? Why are we optimistic? We're optimistic because at the end of the day, we live in the greatest economic superpower on the face of the planet today. We as a country represent 4% of the world's population and yet produce over 20% of the world's economic output. Compare that to China. They are 4 times our size and produce a little bit less than what we do right now. What's the difference? In our opinion, the difference is freedom. Our country has allowed freedom to foster, and with freedom, you have several things that occur. 1, usually a very strong work ethic. 2, innovation, invention, entrepreneurship. And these are the things that continue to create trillion-dollar idea after trillion-dollar idea after trillion-dollar idea. And on top of that, there are things that continue to improve the lives of not only Americans, but people around the world. That is why we have hope for the future, because our hope is not in our politicians. It is in the innovative spirit of our people. And because of that, we feel like the economic future, while it may look more dire in the short term, looks very optimistic in the long term. And with that, we'll open it up for questions.
All right, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, email me, bill@thefoxalliance.com. So we'll take the next 10 minutes or so to answer questions. First question is, how can you have a stock market significantly negative if corporate profits are up? Josh, would you handle that one, please?
Sure. It's a great question because on its face, it doesn't seem to make sense. How can you have negative an S&P 500 that's down 25%, the NASDAQ down over 30, when some of these companies actually are very profitable and the index as a whole actually has positive profits. And the reason for this is the stock market is not, in most cases, a rational decider of price. So if you actually look at the statistics, about 80% of the time, the stock market is slightly overvalued to substantially overvalued. 10% of the time, it's fairly valued. 5% of the time, it is slightly undervalued, and 5% of the time, it is grossly undervalued. And so what that illustrates is that there's a lot of the time where the stock price isn't actually a true reflection of what a private company would be willing to pay for that particular business in a situation like that. The market is a forward-looking indicator. They look to what they think might happen in the future, which is why sometimes you see news and you're like, why is the stock market acting the way it is? A great example of this would be Netflix several months back. Netflix saw about a 2 million person subscription reduction, and the stock price fell like 75%. Did their profits fall 75%? No, they didn't. But people were afraid that this was the start of a trend. So they were trying to look ahead and say, hey, the stock could be worth substantially less if this trend continues. The next quarter, they only lost 1 million subscribers and their price went up 25%. Why? Because people thought, hey, maybe this is the end of them bleeding, or maybe they're not going to lose as many subscribers as we originally thought. And the same thing is true with the stock market. People look ahead and try to make predictions about what they think is going to be the case, and that's how they make investment decisions. The challenge, of course, is that people are inherently flawed and therefore can be wrong and sometimes are wrong. And so that's where you can see prices go down way more than they, in some cases, ought to go. And there's other times where they go much higher than they ought to go. And so that's why it's important for us to recognize that the stock market is a forward-looking indicator. And so based on whatever the market thinks, depending on if there are surprises to those actual beliefs, that's where you can see large movements in price take place.
Thanks, Josh. All right, next question. When do you think that we'll see a bottom in this current bear market? Laura, would you take that one?
Sure. So this is a great question. It's definitely a question we've gotten a lot from our clients over the last 6 months, really. And if we had a crystal ball, then this would be a very different conversation that we'd be having. But one of the things that we at the Fox Alliance have been very adamant about is that right now we're seeing this fight between the Federal Reserve and inflation. And the Federal Reserve is throwing everything that they know how outside of the kitchen sink at inflation, and inflation has barely budged. And so until we see inflation meaningfully adjusted downward by the actions that the Fed is taking, we firmly believe that that's the point at which we'll start to see this market turn around. Now, as Josh just mentioned, the market is a forward-looking indicator. So there will become a point in the next 12 to 24 months where there's a divergence between what's happening in the economy and what's happening in the market. We very well could see the economy, the GDP continue to contract downward and really send us into a firm, definitive recession. And yet the market's still going up. And so when we talk about not using emotion to make decisions when it comes to the market, where we are right now is complicated, but the simple answer is it's all about the Fed's fight with inflation. So as we continue to see interest rates go up and the response that inflation has, that's something that we here at the firm keep an eye on very heavily every single day. But that's the point at which we feel like we'll start to see some major changes in the market.
Thank you, Laura. Next question. Do you expect home prices to fall significantly? Max, would you take that one?
Sure. The short answer to that question is no, we don't expect them to fall significantly, but we do anticipate there to be definitely a slowdown or a decline to some extent in the housing market. We've already started to see that a little bit. That being said, we don't anticipate this to be another 2008 type of scenario. And if you think back to 2008, we saw significant overbuilding. Supply was increasing very quickly and demand was very hot. And ultimately, that all came tumbling down very quickly. The key thing there as well was there was significant leverage. I'll bring that back up in just a second, but there was significant leverage at that time as well. This is very different. We're in a very different situation today. What's driving this slowdown or pause in the housing market is almost entirely connected to rapidly rising interest rates, rapidly rising costs of money. If you look at the 30-year mortgage rate across the board, kind of the national average right now, it's right about 7.1%. That's shocking. If you think back to just somebody had started looking for a house back in February, and you had interest rates somewhere around 3.5, you're now twice the interest rate that you were when you started looking back even 6 months ago. So we've seen a rapid increase in interest rates. And what that's led to, rightfully so, is maybe first-time home buyers or other home buyers just saying, you know what, I think we might rent instead. It's a much more cost-effective means for us right now. Now, generally, what that would lead to is an excess of supply, but we're actually seeing rising interest rates impact the supply side as well, because what we see is sellers who would normally say, hey, let's sell our house and move somewhere else. They're being impacted by the rising interest rates as well. So maybe they're locked in at a 2.75% or 3% mortgage right now. And in order to sell and move somewhere else, they're going to have to accept that 7%. They're unwilling to do that. And therefore, we're not seeing the rapid increase in supply or excessive supply become a reality. So that's a very helpful thing that's protecting us against a significant drop in the housing market on that front. The other thing that I'll mention on this front, which is interesting, is we're still about 5.5 million homes undersupplied right now in terms of just the general market. So we have a long way to go before we actually catch up, and it's taking us quite a while from a building standpoint to make up for that. So when interest rates ultimately either come down or buyers and sellers get used to this new environment, we anticipate growth to continue, probably not to the extent that we've seen, but it will likely kind of get back to a normal basis once we kind of adjust to this new environment or we see the interest rates come back down. One other comment I'll make on this has to do with how the housing market impacts recessions and what that looks like. So if you look back to 2008, kind of real estate driven recession that we participated in, and then back in in the 1980s with the savings and loan crisis, in both instances, excessive leverage had a significant impact on the real estate market and on ultimately the economy and therefore the stock market in the end. If you look back to those time periods, in both instances, the loan to value for both commercial and residential mortgages, which means the percentage of the value that we have, we compare that to the loan that we have outstanding. In both cases, the average was over 100%, which means that the amount that we owed on our mortgage was greater than the value of the house or the real estate itself. That was a very precarious position to be in. If we look today, the national average is 42% on residential mortgages. So we're in a much better position. That's the lowest loan to value ratio we've seen since 2010. And it's a great place to be. So overall, we're in a much stronger position from a real estate standpoint than we have been in recent history. And therefore, we think we're in a much better position as we head into this situation.
All right, next question. Thank you, Max. Next question, Josh, if you can handle this one. If my portfolio drops 30% and it's a static account without new money coming in, how does it rebound and how long does it take?
Good question. A lot of it would come down to what you're invested in and whether or not any other changes happen in the interim. So if you just have a static portfolio and you're not making any changes at all, then functionally, historically, the average recovery takes 3 to 3.5 years on average, if you're not adding any money and if no changes are made. Where things can be different is if you have a portfolio that's down 30%, but you have some components of the portfolio that are down less, say 10, 15%, and you sell those components and you buy things that have dropped 40 or 50, 60%, then you could see recovery occur more quickly. So a lot of it will come down to exactly what you're in and whether or not changes are happening and when those changes take place during the market cycle on the downside. But in a static situation where none of those things are happening, historically, the market generally takes on average between 3 and 3.5 years to recover. Although you have seen some markets like 2008 and the dot-com bubble where those recovery times were closer to 4 to 4.5 years, but 3 to 3.5 is average.
Thanks, Josh. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Max, Laura, and Josh for your insight today. We'll look forward to seeing you at our next quarterly update. And thanks for listening today. Have a great rest of the week.